Welcome to the Reinvention Code. I'm your host, Dorinda Walker. Reinvention isn't random, it has a code. On this podcast, we'll explore what it really takes to navigate life's transitions with introspection, faith, and strategy. If you're evolving, rebuilding, or stepping into a new season, you're not just starting over, you're leveling up. Let's decode your next chapter together.
Hey, beautiful people. Welcome back to another episode. I want to start today's episode by asking you something. When you think about addiction, and I know many of us have a very personal relationship with that word, do you ever wonder how it got there? Not just into your family, but into your community, into the homes of the people you love? Because I spent years thinking about my parents' addiction as something that happened to them, as if it just arrived like a storm with no origin. But it took a lot of research, a lot of prayer, and a lot of painful reflection for me to understand that what devastated my family wasn't random. It was the result of deliberate decisions made by people in power who never had to live with the consequences. Today, we're going to go deep. We're going to talk about the drug epidemic in Black America, not just heroin, not just crack, but the full arc of it, from where it started to what it has become today with fentanyl and opioids changing the landscape all over again. And I'm going to get personal because that's the only way I know how to think about these things for it to make sense to me. And I hope it makes sense for you too. My story is woven into this history. If I can help someone who is struggling themselves or trying to help someone else, is something that fundamentally changed how I understand my own family story. When I started doing my research, I discovered something that stopped me in my tracks. Addiction in my family can be traced back all the way to my great-grandfather's generation. And once I learned what I'm about to share with you, I could no longer see our family's history in the same way. Going back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, before there were real regulations on what could be put into consumer products, before there were warnings on labels or oversight from the federal government, people were being routinely exposed to addictive substances through everyday medicine. Opiates were common ingredients in cough syrups, pain remedies, and products that families bought at their local pharmacy and trusted. These weren't street-level drugs, right? They were products marketed by companies, endorsed by doctors, and sold to ordinary people who had no idea what they were actually consuming. People were not abusing drugs. They were taking what had been sold to them as medicine, often for their children, for chronic ailments, and with no understanding of what dependency looked like or how it would be formed and linger for generations. So when I think about my great-grandfather and his struggle with heroin, I no longer see it as a mystery or moral failure, because what I understand is it is far more likely, and what the history confirms, is that his heroin use was itself a consequence of prior opioid exposure. Because here is something that most people don't know. Heroin was actually introduced in the late 1800s by the pharmaceutical company Bayer. Yes, the same Bayer that makes aspirin. And it was initially marketed as a safe, non-addictive alternative to morphine. It was sold legally, prescribed freely, and consumed by people who had absolutely no idea what they were becoming dependent on. So by the time the dangers became undeniable and regulations began to take hold in the early 1900s, entire generations had already been exposed. My great-grandfather's generation was living inside that reality. So his heroin use almost certainly did not begin with a street-level choice. It likely began with a medicine cabinet. To understand how drugs took hold in Black communities the way they did, you have to understand the conditions that existed before the first needle, pipe, or pill existed. By the time heroin arrived in urban America in any significant way after World War II, Black communities had already been systemically stripped of their economic foundation. Redlining had locked Black families out of home ownership for generations. Segregation had cut off access to quality schools, healthcare, and unemployment. And the civil rights movement, which had given so many people a renewed sense of possibility and hope, had just endured some of its most violent and devastating losses with the assassinations of Dr. King and Malcolm X. Community organizations like the Black Panthers had been infiltrated and dismantled. So hope for a lot of people was a very fragile thing. And I tell you this not to make excuses, but because context matters enormously, right? You cannot understand why addiction took root the way it did in Black communities without understanding what was already there. The grief, the disinvestment, the generational trauma of being told in 1,000 different ways that your life and your neighborhood were not worth protecting. If you watch the movie American Gangster with Denzel Washington, you already have a window into this world. And after this episode, I want you to go back and watch it with fresh eyes. Because what felt like a crime drama is actually a history lesson. Frank Lucas did not build his empire in a vacuum. He understood that there was a supply chain running directly from Southeast Asia, a region known as the Golden Triangle, and one of the largest opium-producing areas in the world, straight into American cities. He positioned himself at the center of it. And what the movie captures, even if it doesn't say it in these exact words, is how the end of the Vietnam War created a perfect storm. Soldiers who had been stationed in that region came home addicted, and the supply that has sustained that addiction followed them home. So by the late 1960s and into the 70s, heroin had flooded urban America. And it didn't land just anywhere equally, right? It concentrated precisely where communities were most vulnerable, most cut off from resources, and most unable to absorb the blow. And at the height of the crisis in New York, Harlem alone had an estimated 1 in 8 residents addicted to heroin. Now let's think about that. What that number means for a neighborhood, for a school, for a family, for a child like me who was trying to make sense of the world around them. And that was the world for my parents. When my father died, everything changed. My father struggled with addiction throughout his whole adult life, and he lost that battle during the AIDS epidemic at a time when the stigma was crushing. The medical resources were scarce, and Black men who were sick were often the last to receive compassion or care. And his death broke something open in my mother that I don't think she ever fully closed, right? She had already been navigating her own struggle with heroin. But grief has its way of finding the wounds that are already there and making them much wider. So after my father died, my mother turned to crack cocaine, and that changed the course of everything for both her and me. And I want you to understand something about crack that is important to this story I'm telling. And I want to give you 2 cultural reference points that will help bring it to life. If you watch New Jack City with Wesley Snipes, that film was based on real people and real events, specifically a Detroit gang known as the Chambers Brothers, who at the height of their operation were running over 700 crack houses and generating an estimated $3 million a day. And if you have been watching Snowfall on FX, that series was loosely inspired by the life of Freeway Rick Ross, a man who built one of the largest crack distribution networks in Los Angeles, and who has since spoken publicly about how the drug was introduced into Black communities on a massive scale and funded by the government. These are not just entertainment stories. They are a mirror held up to a moment in our history that we need to understand. Crack arrived in Black communities in the mid-1980s like a second wave of devastation, right? Right after the heroin epidemic. It was cheaper than powder cocaine, which made it accessible in neighborhoods that had little disposable income. It was faster acting, which made the addiction more immediate and more consuming. And it was more unpredictable in its effects, which made it harder to manage and harder to escape. It didn't just create an addiction, it dismantled families. It eroded the Black middle class. It created a generation of children who grew up watching their parents disappear into drugs that took everything: their money, their time, their presence, their dignity. I want to talk about what addiction cost my mother and what it could not take from my mother. My mother was a remarkable woman. If you're a loyal listener, you know about my mother's journey and her struggle. But if this is your first time listening, I need you to know that before I tell you anything else, my mother was kind in a way that stuck with me, right? She was the kind of person who gave her last dollar to a stranger without hesitation and meaning it with her whole heart. She was funny and full of wit. She was beautiful. She had a gift of music that could have taken her to the top of the R&B charts. And she was also a woman in the grip of two addictions, heroin and crack, in a world that offered her very little in the way of real support or real options. So when my mother's crack addiction took form after my father's death, she eventually lost her apartment, her job. She was living in circumstances that I can only describe as desperate. And desperation has a way of narrowing your world until the only door you can see is the one that leads to your next high. And my mother turned to prostitution to fund that addiction. I say that plainly and without shame because the shame was never my mother's to carry alone. The shame belongs to a system that flooded her community with a substance, criminalized her for using it, and then stripped away her economic options, and then left her without a dignified path forward. She was not a bad person making careless choices. She was a human being in an impossible situation, doing what she believed she had to do to survive. What I understand now, and what I want you to hear, if you're carrying the weight of a parent or a loved one who did things during their addiction that hurt or confuse you, or that you're trying to still make sense of, addiction does not just change behavior. It narrows the entire field of vision. It takes the person you love and puts them in a tunnel where only the light is the drug, right? So understanding that has not erased my pain, but it has transformed it. It gave me the ability to see my mother as a full human being, not defined by her addiction, but not separate from it either. That leads me to this. The war on drugs was never about drugs, right? While my mother and families like mine were living inside the crisis, the political response was not compassion, it was punishment. In 1971, President Nixon declared war on drugs that sounded on the surface like a public health initiative. Decades later, one of Nixon's own top advisors, John Ehrlichman, admitted in an interview what many people had long suspected and what the Black community knows for sure. He said that the Nixon campaign had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people, and that by associating Black communities with heroin and criminalizing drugs heavily, they could disrupt those communities without targeting them directly by name. So that was not a drug war. That was a political strategy dressed up as public safety, and it worked exactly as it was intended to do. Mandatory minimum sentences, mass incarceration, families separated, communities dismantled. And what could have been treated as a public health crisis was instead treated as a criminal justice matter. And the consequences of that choice reverberate to this day. I wrote in my book, Protected by Purpose, that my parents were good people who made bad choices, and that we live in a society that punishes people for their addiction rather than offering help and alternatives. That belief has only deepened as I've learned more about the systemic decision that shaped the environment my parents were living in. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. That means you needed 100 times more powder cocaine than crack cocaine to trigger the same mandatory sentence. So we know the impact of that legislation. Crack was the drug in Black communities, and powder cocaine was the drug in white communities. Same addiction, different zip code, wildly different consequences. That disparity wasn't corrected until 2010. And even then, it was not made retroactive, meaning the people already sitting in prison under the old law stayed there. It's a double standard that still makes me angry. When the opioid crisis began devastating white suburban and rural communities in the 2000s, something remarkable happened. The national conversation shifted. Addiction became a disease, and people needed treatment, not incarceration. Voila, there was federal funding, task forces implemented, Narcan in schools. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm glad those resources exist because every person struggling with addiction deserves compassion and access to care, regardless of where they live or what they look like. But I also want to be honest about what it feels like to know that the same grace being extended now was deliberately withheld from communities like mine for decades. Addiction did not change. What changed was who it was affecting. And that's not a coincidence. That is a pattern, and it is one that we have to be willing to name. This matters to all of us, and I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. This is not just a Black community problem. It never was. And the sooner we stop treating it as if it belongs to one group of people, the sooner we build solutions that actually work. According to the most recent data from the CDC, there were nearly 80,000 drug overdose deaths in America in 2024 alone. That's 80,000 sons, daughters, mothers, fathers gone in a single year. And while that number represents significant decline from the peak of over 110,000 deaths in 2023, which is progress, we should acknowledge that we're still losing nearly 200 people every single day. Fentanyl is involved in most of those deaths, and it doesn't care about your zip code or your income or your race. It's in rural communities in West Virginia and Appalachia. It's in suburban neighborhoods in Ohio and Virginia. And it's in urban communities that have been dealing with the drug crisis for generations. The epidemic is national, and the response needs to match that reality. But what concerns me deeply, and what I think we need to talk about honestly, is the gap between what people need and what the system is willing to provide. Right now, more than 48 million Americans, that's nearly 17% of everyone over the age of 12, are living with a substance use disorder. And of those 48 million people, only about 1 in 10 will receive any specialized treatment in a given year. Let that sink in. We are talking about tens of millions of people who are suffering, who want help, and who are not getting it. Not because they lack the desire to heal, but because the system was never built to serve them. In 2023, only 14.6% of people with a substance use disorder received treatment, and only 18% of people with an opioid use disorder received any medication. The barriers are real: lack of insurance, lack of providers, the stigma, the cost, and a healthcare system that has historically treated addiction as a moral failure rather than a chronic brain disease that medical science has confirmed it to be. And here's where I have to be honest with you about the political dimension of this, because I think we do ourselves a disservice when we pretend that policy doesn't have a direct impact on whether people will live or die. In May of 2025, the Trump administration proposed $28 billion in healthcare spending cuts, including $1 billion from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. That's the primary federal agency responsible for addiction treatment, and $3.6 billion from the CDC. And the entire team of the federal staff who oversaw the national survey on drug use and health, the most important tool we have for tracking the addiction crisis and directing resources to the people who need it the most, were laid off in April of 2025. So when you cut the people who count the bodies and track the data, you are not solving the problem. You are making it easier to ignore a political system that protects the interests of the wealthy and the powerful has always been willing to let the most vulnerable communities absorb the cost of that indifference. We've seen this before, and we're living it again. But I refuse to end there because despair is not a strategy, and it's not who we are. There's solutions that work, and many of them are happening at the community level, which I believe is exactly where they need to be because communities have always been the ones doing the healing that the system refused to do. Naloxone, the overdose reversal medication, is now available over the counter. And community organizations are distributing it in neighborhoods across the country. Nearly 2 million naloxone prescriptions were dispensed in 2024, and the data shows it's saving lives. Telehealth has opened doors for people who could not previously access treatment because of geography, transportation issues, or just the fear and shame of walking into a clinic and admitting they're addicted. Peer support programs where people who have lived through addiction walk alongside others who are in the middle of it. And those are proven to be the most effective interventions because they are built on the one thing that no policy can manufacture, and that's trust. So these harm reduction strategies, which meet people where they are rather than demanding they be somewhere else before they can receive help, are really saving lives, even when the system refuses to. So what I want you to take from all of this is that the solutions exist. They are not mysteries, right? We know what works. The question has never been whether we can solve this. The question has always been whether the people with the power and the money are willing to invest in the lives of the people they have historically viewed as expendable. And we know the answer to that if we look at Project 2025. So what we have to do is keep demanding loudly. We also have to take care of each other. That is what the Black communities have always done. And that is what communities of all kinds have to do right now, quietly and powerfully, in the spaces the system has abandoned. And what I understand now that I wish I would have known then, when I reflect on my mother's life, and y'all know I do that often, I'm struck by how much more I understand about her now than I did as the child who watched her suffer. I understand that the grief of losing my father left her devastated. And although they were separated, they always had a deep love for one another, right? They were high school sweethearts. So their love for one another never went away. And they had a common bond in me. So crack found her in a hopeless place. And I understand that prostitution was not a reflection of who she was at her core, but of what addiction can reduce a person's options to when the system has stripped everything else away. I understand that the methadone clinic she went to may or may not have been intended to help because a lot of what I read about methadone clinics, they were designed to make a profit off of other people's pain. And that medication they gave without genuine support and real pathways to rebuilding a life wasn't management. And it certainly didn't help her to heal. And I understand that she loved me fiercely, even through all of it. People who knew her said that all she ever talked about, even in her darkest moments, was her love for me. My mother was able to overcome her crack addiction because I held a boundary. When she came back into my life after 2 years of prostitution, I told her she would never have access to me or my child if she didn't stop using crack. It was one of the hardest things I had ever said to her, but I meant it. And she told me later that was the greatest gift I ever gave her. So she was able to kick her crack addiction, but she never stopped using heroin. She died a heroin addict. But she was functional as a heroin addict. She worked, she showed up, she paid her bills, she loved with her whole heart. And when she took her last breath on April 20th of 2013, I went through her purse the next morning and found 20 bags of heroin. And I remember smiling as I flushed them down the toilet because that battle with that demon was finally over for my mother. She no longer had to carry the weight of it. So I'm not sharing any of this to leave you in grief or in anger, although both of those are completely valid responses to what I've described. I share it because I believe with everything in me that understanding the full story is itself a form of liberation. When you know what happened to your family was not simply a series of personal failures, but also the result of deliberate policy choices and systemic neglect, it changes how you see people, especially the people you love. It doesn't erase accountability. I've always believed that personal accountability matters, but it expands the frame in a way that makes compassion possible. And compassion for others and for yourself is where healing begins. Black communities have survived every single wave of this assault. We have survived policies designed to destabilize us, substances introduced into our communities with devastating effects, and a criminal justice system that has punished us for our pain. We have survived. We have raised children who are doing the work of understanding, healing, and breaking cycles. And if you're listening to this and you are one of those people, the fact that you're here, that you're asking questions, that you're sitting with this history and refusing to simply accept the narrative that addiction is only a personal failure, that matters. That is how we actually break cycles. I wrote in Protected by Purpose that only God can turn a mess into a message, a test into a testimony, a trial into a triumph, and a victim into a victor. And I still believe that. My parents' lives were so much more than their addiction. And I am honored every day to be the daughter of Boo Boo and Weesey. I carry them in every room I walk into every conversation I have, and into every episode of this podcast. They are the reason I'm not afraid to tell the truth. Before I close, if you are someone who grew up in a family touched by addiction, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not a product of broken people. You are the product of people who are navigating a broken system, often with extraordinary love and very few tools. That distinction matters. Holding on to it doesn't mean that you excuse everything that happened, but it does mean that you give yourself permission to grieve what you lost while also honoring the love that remained. It means you stop carrying shame that was never yours to begin with. And if you are someone who is currently watching a loved one struggle with any of the substances that are devastating communities right now, I want you to remember that compassion and boundaries are not opposites. You can love someone deeply and still refuse to enable the behavior that is destroying them. That's not cruelty. It's wisdom. It's the hardest and most loving thing you can do. So let's get into my reinvention codes for this episode. Number 1, context doesn't excuse behavior, but it always changes how we understand it. Number 2, grief is a door. If you don't tend to it, something else will walk through it. Number 3, how society responds to crisis reveals its true values and its true priorities. And we're seeing this today with Project 2025. Number 4, survival is not the ceiling. It's the floor you build your life from. Number 5, you can grieve the system and still refuse to be defined by it. And number 6, breaking the cycle is one of the most powerful acts of leadership available to any of us. So let me end with this. What happened to Black America around drugs and addiction was not a mistake. It was a policy. Heroin, crack, and now fentanyl. Each wave was allowed to do its damage. And each time our communities were expected to survive without adequate support. But here is what I know. We are still here. We are still building. We are still choosing differently. And the truth, when we have the courage to speak it and the grace to receive it, is always the beginning of something better. Thank you for trusting me with this episode. As always, I wish you much peace, much love, and many blessings. And I'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Reinvention Code. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who's stepping into their next season. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a conversation. Remember, reinvention isn't random. It has a code. I'll see you next time.